So, Nancy, I am delighted that you are here with me today. And can you talk a little bit about what's your professional training and your expertise around bisexuality?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me on your program. I'm really happy to do this, and it's great to see you. Gosh, it's like the personal and the political are so intertwined. I came out as bisexual in college when I was 20, and it's been over 28 years now. Um, and I had decided to go to law school to try to save the world. I was kind of an idealist from the start. And while I was in law school, the first major LGBT rights decision came out by the Supreme Court. And not only was I thrilled on a personal level, but I was intrigued on an intellectual level because Bowers versus Hardwick was still good law. I mean, same-sex intimacy was still illegal. And the Supreme Court seemed to be okay with that. And then overnight, Romer versus Evans happened. And I'll get back to that in a second. But I started just really wanting intellectually to put the pieces of the puzzle together, not just because it affected me personally, but because I was really intrigued. Why did the court do this? So I really started diving into constitutional theory and doctrine and understanding how the court worked. And, that was just the first in a series of decisions affirming LGBT rights that were all very strong, eloquently written decisions, always authored by Justice Kennedy when he was back on the bench. And so I'm tracing these decisions as I'm a lawyer. And I realized in law school, I really wanted to be a constitutional law professor because, I saw how much fun my constitutional law professor was having when he taught the course. And so I always had this hunger to teach after that and to do constitutional law. And I've gotten to do both in my career. So I did political work in DC, lobbying for various causes for a few years, including reproductive rights, which involves very much the same fundamental rights that LGBT rights do. They're very intertwined. The right to autonomy and liberty and deciding who we are and our most fundamental personal life choices, exactly the same rights at play. And I decided to go back to law school, get my advanced law degrees, which positioned me to become a professor. And then I became a constitutional law professor for 3 years at not a great law school. It actually closed its doors within a few years. But I had this amazing experience of getting to teach constitutional law. And in that process, I built upon my dissertation work, which had been about LGBT rights and constitutional rights to autonomy and liberty in our most personal life decisions. And I started focusing on bisexuals and how bisexuals are often left out of that conversation. We don't appear on the face of briefs to the courts. We don't appear in the court decisions. We are constantly erased. And that's not just true in the legal context, but it's true across mainstream media and lots of contexts. But as a lawyer, I was pretty offended that here I am doing so much work for LGBT rights, volunteering left and right, and I'm erased. And so I started publishing legal articles about why bi-erasure matters, how harmful it is, and trying to nudge change in that direction to get us more included. I did end up working after the law school shut down for Lambda Legal, which is one of the biggest LGBT rights organizations in the country that does litigate a lot to the Supreme Court and courts across the country. And I was a squeaky wheel. When they hired me, I said, I'm bisexual. I'm troubled by bi-erasure. I'm going to be working to improve that if you hire me. And to an extent, they let me. There's always a little bit of pushback, but I do want to think that I improved things while I was there, not just with Lambda Legal, but with the ACLU and all the sister organizations, because every time a brief crossed my desk for me to look at and to provide input, I'd say, where's the B? Why are you leaving out bisexuals? And I just was relentless. And so they did start being more inclusive in the way that they wrote briefs. So there has been some progress on that front. So I'm about to rejoin the academia, and I'll be teaching a course on LGBT rights. And, you can be assured that I won't be leaving the B out in my curriculum. So
Well,
that's kind of the nutshell.
That's fantastic. I love the way the personal and professional really intertwined there to bring you to this area of expertise. So I'll be sharing this interview with my class that I'm teaching on bisexuality. And one of the things that we're talking about right now is stigma. And I want them to understand a little bit about institutional stigma and structural stigma. And so ways that laws and policies might affect bisexual people. So can you talk a little bit about, like, when you say, oh, well, they're leaving the B out. Well, why does that make a difference? If this is stuff that's moving forward, like LGBT rights broadly, like, why do we need to make sure that the B is represented?
That's a wonderful question. And that's one of the first questions that I'm often asked and that I've grappled with a lot. The one thing I want to be very clear about is that bisexuals absolutely have the same rights as everybody else. We are protected by laws that prohibit sexual orientation discrimination, even if it doesn't specifically say, and this applies to bisexuals too. So I do want people to be comforted on that front. However, there are real harms, stigma and beyond of bi erasure in LGBT rights litigation. And to begin with, as a matter of demographics and statistics in a social science realm, I'm sure that you that everybody in your course is already aware that there's a disproportionately high rate of mental illness and depression and health problems and violence and sexual assault against bisexuals. And a lot of that is intertwined with the stigma of being erased, of being subject to a lot of discrimination and misunderstandings. So the problem is, it's not intangible alone. It translates into very tangible, very real, and life or death repercussions for bisexuals. And in the legal context, here's how that plays out. When courts don't understand bisexuality, they tend to issue rulings that do harm bisexuals. And there are a couple of contexts where this plays out in really dangerous ways. One of them is in family law. Too often, and this has happened, I've seen this with my clients when I was a private practitioner doing family law. A parent who is bisexual is very often challenged when she's trying to seek custody or visitation or adoption or any kind of rights involving children. Too often, if she was married to a man and they got divorced and she moved on and had a same-sex relationship, the courts too often equate that with instability. And stability is one of the key factors in deciding who gets to have visitation, custody, adoption rights with children. And so when bisexuality is equated, is treated as a proxy for instability, people are at risk of losing their kids, and they do. And that's because bisexual is not understood as a valid sexual orientation. Of course, yeah.
So let me make sure I understand this. They're seeing somebody who was in a relationship with a man and then in a relationship with a woman, and they see that as like changing their sexual orientation, and that is instability. Is that what you're saying?
They don't even give it enough credit to say it's the sexual orientation. They simply say, okay, she was in a relationship with a man and then a woman. She can't decide, what she wants. It's this whole lifestyle is unstable. You don't even see the word bisexual in these court opinions, or even sexual orientation. You just see them saying this behavior is unstable at its core. A child should not be in this environment. And that's how the opinions are written. And a lot of those opinions don't even make it into a written published form. So it happens a lot, but isn't really documented and visible. But I see it a lot as a lawyer, talking to people who are terrified of losing their kids and who sometimes do have their rights at least significantly diminished because of that.
Yeah.
And then an even more life or death situation where bisexual erasure leads to misunderstandings, which leads to real harms, is in the context of asylum and immigration. Too often bisexuals who are seeking asylum because they would be, persecuted, physically attacked, perhaps even killed for their sexual orientation back in their home countries, have been treated with suspicion by asylum adjudicators who heaven forbid they're in the States and in a relationship with someone of a different sex, because then the adjudicator will say, well, you're not queer at all, or you're faking it, or you're not gay enough. And they simply don't understand that they had been in relationships with same-sex people back in their home countries. They had faced persecution. And one of the most extreme examples of that was in the UK, when a bisexual man from Jamaica had faced persecution for being queer. The asylum adjudicators in the UK saw that he had also been in a relationship with a woman. So they said, well, you're not gay. We can't grant you asylum. We don't see, what the threat is here. You're clearly capable of having relationships with women, and you're just not gay enough. And he had to produce photographs of himself being sexually intimate with his male partner before they were convinced that he really was gay enough. And
I just want to
asylum,
pause there because that is astounding.
yeah.
In terms of an asylum case, to be able to justify that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And again, it happens a lot, but isn't documented. These are not decisions that often, translate into written opinions. So we continue to be invisible, even in our persecution, even when we are harmed by the legal system itself. It's not documented. It's not captured. I've done the best I can to try to capture, examples of this. But, when I turn to people in the LGBT community who are hosting conferences or publications, and I say, this is an issue, this needs to, well, where are the written opinions about this? And I'm like, that's exactly the problem. There are not written opinions. This is not being discussed. And that's the problem. And that's what's perpetuating all of this. So stop being complicit. Allow us to tell our stories. Allow us to share these examples. And I've really had to fight tooth and nail to have bisexual issues even be included in the programming. For example, at the LGBT Bar Association conference every year, there was nothing. And I ended up creating, I kind of left this out of my bio description, but I created an organization, the first ever organization for bisexual lawyers and law professors and law students, called Bylaw. And I created the organization in a moment of extreme frustration because I was at the LGBT Bar Association conference. It's called Lavender Law, as I've been every year. And we were kind of on the verge of getting full marriage equality recognition by the court. The Windsor decision had come out, the Obergefell decision hadn't. But one of the lawyers who had argued marriage equality to the Supreme Court was giving the keynote speech, and she got up there and she said, we need to call this what it is. People keep talking about marriage equality or same-sex marriage. Let's just call it what it is. It's gay marriage. Nobody but gays is in a same-sex marriage. This is only affecting gay people. And I just wanted to pull out my hair and scream. And then the door opened right after her keynote speech. The executive director, and I used to be on the board of the foundation board for this. So I used to bring in millions of dollars to this organization. So the executive director knew me. She knew me. She liked me. And she opened up the discussion to everybody in the conference for, let's discuss diversity. We want to focus on diversity and how do we make this more of a diverse conference? And my hand shot up and I said, stop erasing bisexuals. There is no bi programming, bi issues aren't discussed. We were just erased by the keynote speech. Yet again, this has to change. And half a dozen people came up to me afterwards and said, thank you, thank you, thank you. This is what we've been thinking. I'm bi too, and I feel completely erased. And so on the spot, we created Bylaw. And we had to fight tooth and nail for the next couple of years for Bylaw to be recognized, to have programming added. But finally, every year we get our little token panel at this conference, which it is a token. It definitely is a token. We're still generally omitted from the broader discussions. But we also have what we call the Bylaw Caucus every year. And it's just open to anybody who's bisexual or an ally and just wants to be a part of the conversation of being, part of the bi legal community, talking about bi issues, whatever people need. And every year with fail, it is an incredibly emotional experience. People in tears
Yeah.
And now I'm getting teary talking about it because people are so moved and so grateful just to have a space for 1 hour to be in a
Mhm.
room with other bi lawyers and people who understand that it's hard to be erased and it's hard to be a lawyer fighting for LGBT rights day after day and not to be included in that discourse, even as we're giving so much to the movement.
Absolutely. I had a very similar experience in one of my professional organizations where, although it already existed in the Association for Women in Psychology, there's a caucus on bisexuality and sexual diversity. And having that kind of organization within an organization does make a huge difference in terms of feeling like there's a place for, people who are bisexual, but also for people who are interested in supporting bisexual people and bisexual rights and mental health and all of that. So I think it's wonderful that you created that. You're such an advocate in every setting that you're in, it seems like. And so what a benefit to the organization and to the community.
Thanks. I have to say that I'm kind of at burnout point. I really am. Because for a while there, it felt like I was doing so much work with so little reward, and
Yeah.
bi movements get no funding. We were doing this all on our own time.
Yeah.
We were writing amicus brief to the Supreme Court saying, please don't exclude bisexuals, but it's draining. I always took the lead in getting those amicus briefs done. And
Yeah.
at one point, my mother had just been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I was really needing to be by her side. And I said, I've got to pass the torch.
Yeah.
And there wasn't anybody else who really stepped up to do it.
Yeah.
And that was hard. It's really hard when you feel like you're carrying a lot of the weight yourself. And I keep trying to pass the torch. Bylaw is very informal. We don't really do a
Mhm.
lot in between caucuses. I wanted it to be a really active organization that had a network of bi lawyers who could help other bi people across the country. But it takes work. It takes resources. We don't have
Yes.
funding. We don't have resources. The lawyers are really busy people. And so it's hard. It's hard. I don't feel like I've succeeded in everything that I wanted to. I just kind of got the ball rolling, but others need to step up and do the work too. And it's hard to ask that of my colleagues when the broader community isn't helping.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, I'm hearing so many different things in terms of what you're seeing happen to bisexual people within the legal system, in terms of, that there's this assumption that, like, oh, if you're bisexual, things are easier for you. Things aren't so bad, which is why there's this, issue around asylum seeking.
Mhm.
And at the same time, it is harder because there are things like if you're trying to, for parental rights, and people are seeing you as unstable because you've been in relationships with people of more than one gender. And then when you're in the position of like trying to advocate for this within your profession, constantly being erased and lack of support for specific focus on this population, on this issue that this is real. These
Yeah.
problems are real.
And there's if we have the time, there's a couple of examples that really bring that all together.
Yes, please.
It's so frustrating. Okay, so one example, I had mentioned Romer versus Evans, and I said I'm going to come back to that. Okay, I'm coming back to that. Romer versus Evans was the first major LGBT rights decision. Came out in 1996. The court said you can't have this constitutional amendment that singles out a class of people and denies them rights across the board. This amendment had basically said, now, the text of the amendment said, gays and bisexuals cannot seek civil rights protections in the state of Colorado. The text spelled out gays and bisexuals.
Mhm.
Here's what happens. Our own advocates, our lawyers, in their briefs to the court said, okay, we are going to identify the class of people affected by this amendment. It is only gays. Only gays are affected by this amendment. And so we are going to refer to that class of people from here on out as gays. And the Supreme Court followed their lead. And ever since Romer versus Evans, gay has been the shorthand way of describing it. Bisexuals have been erased. And it wasn't always the case, because before Romer versus Evans, there was the Boston St. Patrick's Day Parade case, which was not a victory for LGBT rights. We lost. But bisexual was in the name of the organization. Bisexual was all over the briefs and the Supreme Court opinions. They're capable of saying the B word, but our own lawyers told them not to in Romer versus Evans, and they have not ever since, including in the most recent decisions. So
now, why would they do that? What?
Oh, I could, I have theories, and I have had conversations, with people in the movement who've said, well, yeah, strategically, it was a conscious decision. There are strategic reasons why. In some ways, they thought that bisexuals muddied the issues and made things more complicated. But in fact, we actually could make things a lot more clear, because we certainly illustrate, for example, how sexual orientation is a form of sex discrimination. And this is an argument that I've been begging, my colleagues in the movement to make for years, and they have consciously decided not to. And the argument goes like this. Now, in the most recent Supreme Court decisions, the Supreme Court has been wrestling with this very issue, which is that, is sexual orientation covered by civil rights laws that protect sex discrimination? Is sexual orientation discrimination a form of sex discrimination? And bisexuals illustrate beautifully that it is a form of sex discrimination, because, and here's how I explain it, and have been for years. If I, as a bisexual woman, had asked for the right to marry back when marriage equality hadn't been recognized, and then I was living in Indiana, and I said, hi, I'm bisexual, I'd like to marry this man, is that a problem? Well, of course not, you're marrying a man, why would that be a problem? And I'd be granted the right to marry. But if I went to that same clerk of courts and said, hi, I'm bisexual, I want to marry this woman, well, no, you can't get married to a woman, we don't allow that in the state of Indiana. There is only one thing that's changed in that equation, and that is the sex of the person I want to marry, not my sexual orientation. The sexual orientation is a constant. So bisexuals really illustrate very cleanly how, in fact, sex discrimination includes sexual orientation discrimination. One is the form of the other. But they will not make that argument.
But this is so great, because one of the things that I'm doing with this class is talking about centering bisexuality. And when you actually see things through the lens of bisexuality, it sometimes makes everything clearer for other populations as well. So thank you. That's a fantastic example.
Well, going back into the negative, flipping it back to the negative again, another example that's really painful is in the marriage litigation, when marriage was moving up to the Supreme Court, and you had this Proposition 8 case in California that was one of the first cases to really get that ball rolling at the Supreme Court level. Ted Olson was one of the two, big lawyers who was arguing on behalf of LGBT people to try to get marriage equality. Sandy Steyer was one of the main plaintiffs in that case. She and her, female partner, wanted the right to marriage. Sandy Steyer used to be married to a man. So Ted Olson decided that he needed to preemptively address that problem with the case. So he puts her on the stand, and he cruelly, belligerently, I feel, said to her, you used to be married to a man, and now you want to be with a woman? Which is it? What are you? You can't go from one to the other. And he forced her to basically say, I never really loved the man I was married to. That wasn't real. This is real. This is the only thing that matters. I was gay all along. And it breaks my heart. Her answer is valid for her. She can identify however she wants. That's not the point. The point is that he did that to her, that he felt the need to explain away her bisexuality and to have her deny it. Because if she in fact had been bisexual, if she in fact had loved a man, then somehow that makes her unworthy of marriage equality. That's one of the most painful things for me to read, is that transcript of that hearing. And that nobody called it out. Nobody seemed bothered by it. I mean, it's like the movement was behind that. So yeah, it hurts. It hurts. Yeah. And it hurts the movement. I think it hurts the integrity of the movement, because the movement, the LGBT rights movement, is trying to fight for our rights based on the right to make our most intimate life choices without interference from others, the right to equal dignity, equal respect. And when they take that away from bisexuals, then
Mm,
they've lost standing. They've lost credibility. They've lost integrity in their own arguments. So I think it hurts the movement, as
mm.
well as bisexuals. I think it hurts all of us when bisexuals are erased.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Thank you for those really poignant examples. So let me ask you one more question, because we've talked about, sort of family situations. We've talked about asylum. What about workplace issues? Like, is that a place that you see um, structural stigma around bisexuality affecting people?
Yeah, I mean, on the legal front, I use the same example as for marriage. If an employer discriminates against me, when I'm dating someone of the same sex, but not when I'm dating someone of another sex or gender, that illustrates how it's a form of sex discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been there's a piece, a law review piece written by my friend Ann Tweedy, who is another out bi lawyer advocate, um, who did document that bisexuals do again face discrimination, in unique ways, and in some ways to a greater degree than gays and lesbians in the workplace, because it's not accepted or understood, and that's a problem. And I hate to say it, but the worst discrimination I have faced has been from gays and lesbians working for the movement, as opposed to from straight people working in more mainstream environments. But
Mm-hmm.
which isn't to say that I've definitely faced discrimination too, um, in a law firm setting, but not at my current job, but at a past job, it was more of that whole like hypersexualization of bisexuals. Like once the partner at the firm found out I was bisexual, he wanted to turn me into one of the guys and start talking about, what kinds of women do you find sexually attractive? And he wanted to have that conversation with me all the time. Um, I don't think that would have happened if I had come out to him as gay.
Right.
Might have, but it was definitely because I came out as bisexual.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing definitely happens in the workplace to
Mm.
bisexuals.
And what I'm hearing also is those sort of, because we're talking about attitude, sort of interpersonal kind of stigma, but it seems like that all then sort of is an overlay, the kinds of things people think about bisexuals, the instability, the over sexualization of bisexuals on an interpersonal level. That same stuff is what plays out on an institutional level as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you think is important for the students to hear?
Um, I guess one more example is in a criminal law context. Again, it can be a life and death issue. There's a documentary film called The Staircase that I recommend watching about a man who probably was innocent, probably was not guilty. It's one of those things like you'll never really know. Um, but it's very clear his wife had died falling down a staircase, and the question was whether or not, it was an accident or whether he
Mm,
had pushed her. There were no witnesses, so it was all about, the forensic evidence, and how the angles of, all of that. But it came out that he was bisexual. And that became a huge part of the jury deliberations and the judge's comments, and the family member witnesses turned on him because they all kept saying, well, wait, if he lied about that, then he can't be trusted. He's the kind of person who would commit murder. Um, and then it came out that his wife had actually known he was bisexual, and he kept saying she was okay with it. She was okay with it. She loved me. We loved each other. Well, no, she couldn't have been okay with it. He must have killed her to protect his secret. And
wow.
so it's very clear. Now, I don't know for sure whether he was guilty or not, but it's very clear that they equated his bisexuality as an indicia. I'm not sure how to say the word, but I should. But they viewed that as evidence of his
Mhm.
untrustworthiness and even propensity to commit murder.
Wow. And
And
how long ago was this case approximately?
it was recent. It was in the past 10 years.
Oh my gosh.
And so, you have people who are going to be put on death row if that's the way that people view bisexual criminal defendants.
Yeah.
So again, it really is a matter of life or death.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, you have illustrated so well the real problems with structural stigma for bisexual people in terms of a legal context. Thank you so much, Nancy. The fabulous Nancy Marcus. Just thank you for all the work that you have done and continue to do. I think your students are incredibly fortunate to get to learn from you, and we're all really fortunate that you are advocating for our values and our rights. So
And
thank you so
back at
much.
you, Professor Israel. Your students are so lucky to have you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.
Yeah.